who plays Edna O'Brien in a film adaptation of your life?
Oh, this is nice. Is there a producer in the audience?
Thanks very much, Bernard, and it's a great pleasure to be here tonight to introduce Teddy St. Aubyn. But before I can introduce Teddy, I have to introduce my wife. Now, she knows Teddy as well, if not better than I do. Her name is Mariah Aitken. She's not here tonight as she's directing Private Lives in DC. But when I called her last night and said, what should I say about Teddy? Without a second's hesitation, she said, I should say that he was a coruscating jewel in the crown of English literature. Well, that should do it, I thought. Although I should add that she's a godmother to Teddy's son, Lucian, and may not be entirely non-partisan here. We first read Teddy's work 14 or 15 years ago, when the Patrick Melrose trilogy was available in the UK, but not here yet. We adapted it into a movie script with Teddy's cooperation, but we got nowhere. Everyone we approached said it was too dark. Actually, that was the attraction. And I believe that that tide may now at last be turning. I hope so. Anyway, what struck me particularly about those first Melrose novels, the Padre novels, as the Spanish apparently call them, as they're about Patrick's father, David Melrose, to distinguish them from the later Madre novels, was that while they were fueled by chaos and horror, at the same time there was an immaculate precision and elegance in the writing, and it brought a sort of redemptive light into that darkness and certainly underscored the movement of the trilogy, which was a cautious and halting progress toward healing. There was also a lot of wit. Examples are legion, and I'd like to give you one. This is from Some Hope. A character called Kitty returns from visiting her son who's emigrated to Australia. She's telling her friends about it at a party. She's not at all keen on the way of life, she says. Quote, Fergus took me to the coast and forced me to go snorkeling. All I can say is that the Great Barrier Reef is the most vulgar thing I've ever seen. It's one's worst nightmare. Full of frightful loud colours, peacock blues and impossible oranges, all higgledy-piggledy while one's mask floods. Now, I'm happy to say that Teddy's sense of humour is foregrounded in the novel that we're celebrating tonight, Lost for Words. Now, curiously, what we discovered as we got to know Teddy was that much of what you can say about the prose can also be said about the man, which is by no means always true of writers. A lovely human being can write a dire book, and on the other hand, a nice piece of work can be produced by a very nasty piece of work. But Teddy is elegant, he is gracious, he is succinct, he is very clever and very funny. In short, he's very good company, as are his novels. He also possesses unsuspected attributes. I remember seeing him in London once after I'd got back from Dublin. I've never lived in Ireland and I wasn't born there, but I told him that when I was over there, I felt I knew what they were thinking and that they knew what I was thinking. I had a strong feeling, I said, that I was among my own people. Teddy said that, yes, he had that same feeling when he was in Cornwall. And then he paused and said in a rather dreamy way, but then we used to own it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a coruscating jewel in the crown of English literature and a man who once owned Cornwall, Teddy St. Aubyn.
Good evening. I'm going to read to you from my new book. I've read very little from this book, so this is not a polished performance, but a dangerous experiment. And I've never read for so long from any of my books. This is a satire on literary prizes, which paradoxically has triggered 2 shortlistings for me in the 2 weeks since it was published. One of them really bore out some of the characteristics of the prize in this novel. It was an Italian prize that I got shortlisted for, and then I was asked if I'd come to Tuscany. And I said, unfortunately, I'd be in New York. And so they took me off the shortlist. Because the point of a literary prize is for writers to promote it. And anyone who thinks that prizes are there to promote writing have got it the wrong way round. And then there was another one which I won, in fact, for the P.G. Wodehouse Prize. And I had what every writer dreams of, which is a pig named after my novel. Because there's a pig in a lot of P.G. Wodehouse's novels, I guess. Rather than giving me a huge house or something, they gave me a pig. So anyway, it's a satire on literary prizes. The Elysian Prize is in no way like the Booker Prize. And any resemblances are purely coincidental, but it shares a couple of characteristics, which is that every writer wants it, and that the judges are completely incompetent. And so the committee is the usual hodgepodge of backbench MPs, obscure actors, retired civil servants, and so forth, and who are reading novels for the first time in their life, naturally very excited about it. Now, one of them is called Penny Feathers, who's an aspiring thriller writer herself. I can't read you her work. Unfortunately, we haven't got time, but in this scene, she is checking out a novel which Malcolm, who's the head of the committee, the backbench MP, has asked her to read because it's Tobias's favourite novel, and Tobias is the actor who adores this novel. The other people mentioned in this chapter are other members of the committee, Joe Cross, who's a journalist, and Vanessa Shaw, who's the sort of heroine. She's the one member of the committee who's interested in literature. So, here we go. Actually, I'm going to have a drink. Penny had been asked by Malcolm to check out Tobias's favourite novel, All the World's a Stage. According to the blurb, it was an ambitious and original novel written by a young New Zealander from the point of view of William Shakespeare. It gave a richly textured portrait of Jacobean London, as well as taking the reader inside the mind of the greatest genius in all human history. Penny felt instinctively that this one would be a survivor. Choosing a New Zealander would be a salute to the Commonwealth, and at the same time, the theme was patriotic and educational. With the long list being announced tomorrow, she plunged straight in. William, Ben, do you know Thomas Kidd and John Webster? Lads, said William, giving the men a friendly nod. Thomas returned his smile, but John continued to scull out of the window, ignoring William. John would as soon bastinado a man's shanks as shake his hand, explained good Master Johnson. He was not yet 13 when he murdered the blacksmith he was apprenticed to. News came in that day of great Marlowe's death, and John was thrown into the blackest grief. There's a great spirit gone, quoth he. Indeed, the tears lie in an onion that should water that sorrow, quoth the blacksmith. Whereupon such a choleric humour came o'er John that he lifted the glowing poker from the coals of his master's furnace and plunged it into the wretched blacksmith's entrails. Never a man died with a more astonished expression on his face. unless it was King Edward, second of that name. Before William could respond to this amazing tale of murder, most foul, strange, and unnatural, John rose up in his chair in a state of great excitation and pointed through the window. All eyes, all eyes! My Lord Essex comes hard upon us with a great retinue of men. How finely caparisoned they are, and point device in their accoutrement. Oh, happy horse that bears the weight of Essex, said William, straining out of the casement to catch a glimpse. See how his mount's proud impatient hoof doth ring far from the cobblestones, said old Thomas Kyd. How like a god he is in countenance, in bearing, how like a king. William sank back down next to Master Ben despondently. My pleasure lies in Essex, he sighed, but I wait in vain for any sign or any summons. I am a mere slave that tends upon the hours and times of his desire. Come, William, said Ben, slapping him on the shoulder. Enough of that. Let us have one more gaudy night and mock the midnight bell. I've sold my latest play to this innkeeper for 5 shillings of sack. He understands not a word of it, poor fool, but hopes to sell it for a profit to the Chancellor's men. Would I had a play to sell, said William, and we would have roasted capons withal. But I only started one this morning, and shall not finish it till the morrow. Those were the days. Yeah. What is its argument? Asked Ben. Why, it is a Roman play, said William. It tells the tale of Antony and how one of the 3 pillars of this world was made into a strumpet's fool. Penny couldn't help admiring the way it made you feel you were really in the tavern with William Shakespeare and his pals. That was the wonderful thing about historical novels. One met so many famous people. It was like reading a very old copy of Hello magazine. She read on eagerly. Speaking of strumpets, said Thomas, is that not Mistress Lucretia that comes hard upon us? Ah, said William, now let us speak of Africa and golden joys. She comes so perfumed that the winds are lovesick that follow her. The fair Lucretia hoisted up her skirts, the better to straddle William's legs. Fie, William, she said, clicking his golden earring against her teeth. Where is that sonnet you promised me? Why, 'tis in my codpiece, said William. For a man is a fool who keeps not a poem in his codpiece, and a codpiece that hath no poem in it is indeed a foolish codpiece. It is a naughty codpiece, said John, for it hath naught in it. Ho, ho, said goodly Master Johnson, draining his tankard of sack. A battle of wits. With this naught, said William, clasping Lucretia by the waist and pulling her towards him, I shall make a copy of thy fair face. I shall so plough thy field with this nothing that it will yield thee a crop of Lucretias. With this round O I shall make thy belly round. And by my death, he added, shuddering and sinking backwards in his chair, I shall make thee immortal. Fie, William, said Lucretia, arching backwards and pulling William towards her. Keep thy wit for thy plays, for wit is a poor actor that comes on and plays his part and leaves the stage and is heard no more. But the part I would have you play hath more will in it than wit. Penny was definitely going to give All the World's the Stage the thumbs up. It was chock-a-block with colourful characters and period detail, just like her other favourite, the Enigma Conundrum. A real page-turner about the Enigma code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park during the Second World War, which included a marvellous portrait of the brilliant, but alas gay, Alan Turing, the Cambridge mathematician who'd done the thinking behind the computer. There was also a portrait of the unsung hero who built Colossus, the first actual computer right here in Britain. After the war, this ordinary postal worker had simply got on his bike and gone back to repairing people's telephones. No commercial fortune or Nobel Prize or knighthood for him, just the quiet pride of knowing that he'd served his country in its hour of need. Marvelous, inspirational stuff, so unlike today's attention-seeking, get-rich-quick culture in which people did things they were completely unqualified for just to get their names in the papers. The portrait of Churchill was utterly convincing. You could almost smell the cigar smoke and the brandy on his breath. Apart from anything else, one really learnt something from such a well-researched book, which was more than can be said of the neurotic musings of a lot of writers stuck at home, reading, writing, and thinking about literature. Why didn't they get out and do something for a change? Work in public service, or in a factory, or teach in a school. Get out of their narrow little worlds and meet some real people. Anything rather than sit at home all day writing. It was a strange experience for Penny to be seeing Jo Cross in the flesh, although she rather avoided Jo's op-ed pieces, sounding off about every subject from abortion to Zimbabwe. Penny was a huge fan of the Home Front, Jo's weekly column complaining about her husband and children. The only member of the committee Penny really found it hard to take was Vanessa Shaw. She was so frightfully intellectual, but not, in fact, in Penny's opinion, really that clever. She was mad about a novel called The Frozen Torrent, which Penny had been unable to make any headway with. The whole thing was, according to Vanessa, built and unbuilt on systematic self-contradiction, just as life was built on the contradiction of death. Ugh. Not only did the text, as if it had just popped up on her mobile phone, show a deep reading of Beckett, Blanchot, and Bataille, whoever the last two were, but also brought to this, quote, self-corroding sensibility, good God, the richness of a profound and original psychological novel. In other words, the author had stolen all his ideas and didn't just contradict himself by mistake, which, let's face it, happens to all of us now and again, but actually set out to contradict himself. It made her blood boil to think that this charlatan, with his second-hand ideas and phrases and his absurd habit of self-contradiction, was going to get his wretched novel onto the long list. Okay. Now, just to show that this isn't an entirely silly novel, I have a passage. Vanessa is the member of the committee who's a Cambridge Don and who teaches literature and is quite passionate about it. And she has a couple of dysfunctional teenage children. One of them is Poppy, a daughter who's suffering from anorexia. And so Vanessa's sitting at home in her house in Cambridge. The text that was dominating Vanessa's thoughts as she sat at home, looking out at the bird feeder hanging from the apple tree in her back garden, was not one of the Elysian Prize submissions, nor indeed was it the PhD thesis she was supervising, in which the semicolon had just arrived obscurely from Italy and was being disseminated into English literature by the erudite Ben Jonson. The text she couldn't get off her mind was written by her daughter. In a perversion of filial piety, Poppy had asked Vanessa to use her critical skills to improve the little manifesto she was writing for a pro-Anna website, extolling the hidden ecstasies of her suicidal eating disorder. Vanessa felt that her relationship with her daughter had gone irretrievably through the looking glass, the very same looking glass in which Poppy saw her skeletal and hirsute body as a repellent mass of white flab. The piece was handwritten with no corrections in a pink notebook with a brass clasp holding its covers together. It rested on a small round table next to Vanessa, looking more like the diary of a 14-year-old girl than the exercise book of a grown woman. Vanessa didn't need to read it again, couldn't face reading it again. It was a defiant prose poem on the subject of emaciation and the beatitude of extreme hunger, the breakthrough when the girling, it turned out, was the hormone for hunger, turned into the radiance, the single-pointedness, the febrile quickness, the humming wah. Ranged against these incisive mental joys was the cunning enemy and intolerable temptation of food, as if every scrap were as tragic as Eve's first bite of the forbidden fruit, a fall, a rush of shame, an exile from the luminous sphere of control and self-sufficiency, a self-sufficiency that would one day go beyond the rejection of food and liquid and perfect itself by discarding air as well. If only this constriction in her chest and throat could be expressed in tears, but Vanessa had never found it easy to cry, and she knew that there was little point in looking for relief in that direction. They were all sticks in the whirlpool of Poppy's ferocious will. The weaker she became physically, the stronger her psychological pull. A principled hunger strike like Gandhi's, which was aimed at achieving something in the outside world, looked very impure and compromised compared to a hunger strike whose sole object was to stop eating. This was the white on white of the hunger strike, the moment when it became abstract and transcended the clumsy literalness of merely demanding one thing or another. She felt a violent desire to tear the bird feeder off its branch. And then she realized that she was thinking of King Lear after Cordelia's death. Why should a bird have life when Poppy... And then she found herself wondering why any book should win this fucking prize that she had become involved with unless it had a chance of doing what had just happened. Coming back to a person when she wanted to cry but couldn't, or wanted to think but couldn't think clearly, or wanted to laugh but saw no reason to. Okay, also so there's a committee, some of whom you've now met, and then there's a group of writers, some of whom have submitted novels for the prize. But there's also a man called Didier, who is a French intellectual, who's a friend of several of the players in this book, and is himself writing a text, some of which you'll hear in this reading. And he's in love, like almost every man in this book, with a woman called Catherine, who tends to have several simultaneous lovers and to sack them unexpectedly. She's a femme fatale. Didier is temporarily in possession of her. Didier watched as coffee trickled from the espresso machine in Catherine's kitchen into a tiny cup resting on the metal grill beneath, knowing that the fourth espresso was usually the one to tip him into a frenzy of creativity. He knocked back the bitter little draught while it was still steaming, placed the cup directly in the sink, and returned with relish and a slightly burnt mouth to his computer. Catherine was out for the day, giving him the further impetus of solitude. He was soon typing rapidly, thrilled by the intelligence and authority of the words rippling onto the screen. Nietzsche announced the death of God. Foucault announced the death of man. The death of nature announces itself with no need for an intermediary. As these three elements of our classical discourse dissolve in the acid rain of late capitalism, we are offered the consolation of its own pale triumvirate: the producer, the consumer, and the commodity. Thanks to advertising, the producer sells the commodity to the consumer. Thanks to the internet, the consumer is the commodity sold to the producer. This is the utopia of borderless democracy, a shift of signifier in the desert of the real. This is the playground of unlimited freedom, the opportunity to define ourselves through the gratification of ever more perverse and hybridized fetishism. This is the celebrated openness of a technology that is at the service of perpetual supervision. It is this open field that is the supreme disguise. In the absence of a hidden object, we cannot see what we see, because we have abandoned the need to search. As for searching, let our engines do it for us. The thought that cannot think itself is that we will die of thirst before we reach the shining city of individual gratification, which was never made of anything other than the shimmering heat waves of a collectively conditioned desire. In the rhetoric of bourgeois liberalism, conformity deploys the language of rebellion, precisely because there is no possibility of revolution. We are at the point in history where it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The anxiety once expended on the mutual annihilation of warring political ideologies is now expended on the universal annihilation through ecological catastrophe. Preferably, of course, a catastrophe that is not going to happen, rather than the one that is happening. We would rather watch a movie about the threat of a meteor from outer space than contemplate the actual impact of the capitalist meteor on the Earth. We may be frivolous consumers of information who cannot stop eating popcorn until the US Air Force has saved humanity by destroying the alien meteor with nuclear weapons. Or we may be serious consumers of information who enjoy the voluptuous guilt of betraying the polar bear, or worry that our grandchildren may never know the pleasures of skiing in the Alps, or wish we had bought an apartment on a higher floor of the Manhattan skyscraper where we live. Finally, it is of no importance, because both catastrophes, the fantastic and the actual, are deployed to distract us from the desert of the real, into which we have marched the exhausted culture of the West. In this desert, it is forbidden to think. Even if capitalism is the crisis, capitalism must be the solution. Didier paused, waiting for a second preposterous paradox to pop into his head. He was en pleine forme, no doubt about it. Would another espresso send him spiraling into a circular and inconclusive sterility, or keep him riding on the rushing and glittering wave of la pensée? Before he could decide, the ping of an incoming email drew his attention to the lower corner of the screen. He would usually have ignored an email in the midst of writing, but this one was from Catherine and might require a quick reply. He clicked on his mail icon and read her message. Didier, you'll probably think me very cowardly to tell you this by email, but I don't feel that I can go on being with you. I know this is the second time, and that you'll think I shouldn't have taken you back if I wasn't serious. But my restlessness is, as you might say, structural and not personal. I would have left whoever I was with at this point, because I need continual change to keep me ahead of the wolf pack, whatever that is. I'm going to Italy with a girlfriend for 2 weeks. I have an inkling of a new novel and want to see if I can start it there. You're welcome to stay in the flat until I get back. Please forgive me, and don't cut me off from your wonderful company unless you have to. Love, Kay. Didier felt the glittering wave collapse around him and found himself tumbling and spinning and struggling to know which way was up. How could she do that? How could she suddenly do that? He thought of Lacan's opaque but strangely compelling remark, "Woman does not exist," which does not mean that she cannot be the object of desire. Whatever charm this insight had once held for him, it slipped through his grasp as he groped for a sane response to Catherine's email. She had ruined a day's writing. That, at least, was a concrete starting point for his resentment. Mercifully, his focus on lost writing reminded him that he would one day enfold his present suffering into a masterful analysis of desire or love or delusion. It hardly mattered. He would perform a vivisection without anesthetic on any abstract noun that presumed to rule his life. He knew it would be some time before he could gather enough detachment for that task. Rome wasn't deconstructed in a day, he thought, immediately typing the sentence onto his screen to see if he felt the return of some measure of control. He did not. Didier got up from his desk and suddenly swept the coffee cup from its ledge of papers, smashing it against the wall of Catherine's drawing room. He would have his revenge. He didn't yet know what it would be, but he would write something about love or delusion or desire that she would never forget. As this thought died out, Didier pictured himself sweeping the coffee cup against the wall and suspected that there was something staged about the gesture. Yes, he had been in the stupidity of his unconscious and its mechanical discharge of emotion. He wished he could have the cup back so that he could experience the full tension between the gestural cliché and the more subtle and refreshing operations of his intellect, and then refuse the gesture. He sat down again and typed out a sentence. Impulsiveness always points to the absence of spontaneity. That was better. He could work with that. In the meantime, he had joined Sam and Alan in Catherine's Salon des Refusés. Would he try to preserve the dignity of having lasted a few more weeks than either of his rivals, or join them in an enclave of nostalgia and bitterness? There were several emails from Sam he had not answered because of the danger of being unavoidably, or structurally, as Catherine would want him to say, so as to enforce the tyranny of English facetiousness, patronizing. He might now be able to reply to Sam, but first he would reply to Catherine. Didier got up again and started pacing the room. The wolf pack she was keeping ahead of, that was the way in. He felt the richness of its hermeneutic potential. Once he started interpreting something, the problem was how to stop. All he needed was a first sentence and one more espresso.
Good evening. Some 30 years ago, I was introduced to Edna O'Brien. Afterwards, I began reading her. There are some great moments etched in life that you don't forget. And in the case of my meeting Edna across a dinner table, what is so vivid, like first encountering her between the covers of a book, is the inseparable nature of the visual, the audible, and experiential. Dazzling in every measure, words, the cadence of her considered, lilting speech, grit, incredible beauty, a coherence of thought and expression and observation, the whole of it. In person, as you'll discover tonight, Edna is as dazzling as the written words that led Philip Roth to call her the most gifted woman now writing in English. Edna is also famous as a troublemaker. A well-meaning literary judge once called her, Teddy, the Solzhenitsyn of Irish life, which I think is vastly unfair to her on about 12 different counts, but I get the suggestion, however misguided and appropriately honorific. Edna's first novel, and the first of her work that I read, The Country Girls, is an evocation of post-war Ireland and its stifling repression, social, sexual, political. Like her next two novels, it was banned and burned in the land of her birth, and to all our great benefit, she left Ireland for a much larger universe. Since Country Girls was published in 1960, Edna has continued to break literary ground in short stories, novels, poems, and plays, and especially her most recent and great an appropriately titled memoir, Country Girl. To get an idea of, and you're going to see it tonight, I was just backstage with Edna, and we were talking, and my wife and I were just out west in this fabulous canyon country, and I was telling Edna about it, and she said how, it's like the first night I met her. And she started talking about how she wished she had seen that part of the West. The only part of the West, as she put it, she had ever been to was Duluth, and it was snowing. And she said, I felt like I was inside a paperweight. That's who you're going to hear tonight. Think about that. Just this is extraordinary. I looked into Country Girl. And, I thought, well, I'll look for something to read, a paragraph or whatever. And I started going through it and realized every paragraph is so perfectly constructed that I could choose any one. The first one I went to, and I'll read for half a second because Edna will read. But it was about halfway on the journey when my husband stopped in order to have tea, which he had brought in a flask. We went into a cornfield where the harvest had already been taken and the ground was spiked in stubble. There were geese at the far end and a gander with its neck craned, hissing and determined to drive us away. The story I was reading was Chekhov's The Steppe. The parched plain, the sunburnt hills, the peasant women binding the sheaves of corn, and the terrible stagnancy in the story resembled the place I was in. I just opened the book and went to that. This is Edna O'Brien. Paul McCartney has described the experience of Edna O'Brien perhaps better than any of us ever will. He walked her home late one night and afterwards improvised yet another McCartney masterpiece. Oh, Edna O'Brien, she ain't lying. You gotta listen to what she gotta say. She'll have you sighing, she'll have you crying. Hey, she'll blow your mind away. It's my privilege to introduce to this audience in New York again, the great, wonderful, fabulous Edna O'Brien.
Well, well, it seems I was here 8 years ago, and now I'm very happy to be back. I'll read a little bit. I've been trying to time myself in there while Teddy was reading, and trying to shorten it, but not too short. Not too short. I was in a national health clinic in London, and an amiable girl with a mass of brown hair and a foreign accent had tested me for deafness. You are quite well, but with regard to your hearing, you are broken piano. She looked to see if this had any disquieting effect upon me and then reeled off the hazards of old age. Finally, she wrote down the day and the date on which I could come and collect the 2 hearing aids, which I dutifully did, but I have failed to use them. They slipped like little ball bearings into the cavity of the inner ear, and retrieving them is nigh impossible. So they are back in the brown envelope in which they came. But at home that day, the garden was waiting. The second flowering of the roses washed, pink and blousy, but beautiful. And the massed leaves on the 3 fig trees were a ripple as birds darted in and out, chasing each other, half in courtship and half in combat, as it always is. Broken piano, in all its connotations, kept saying itself to me, and yet I thought of life's many bounties, to have known the extremities of joy and sorrow, love, crossed love, and unrequited love, success and failure, fame and slaughter, to have read in the newspapers that as a writer I was past my sell date, and moreover, a bargain basement, Molly Bloom. Yet, regardless, to go on writing and reading, to be lucky enough to be able to immerse myself in those two intensities that have buttressed my whole life. I got out a cookery book from Ballymaloe House in County Cork, where I'd stayed, and partook of delicacies such as nettle soup and Carrageen moss soufflé. And it was there I had seen for the first time and been astonished by the paintings of Jack Yeats, thick palettes of curdled blues that spoke to me as deeply of Ireland as any poem or any fragment of prose could. I looked up the recipe for soda bread and did something I had not done in 30-odd years. I made bread, broken piano or not. I felt very alive, as the smell of the baking bread filled the kitchen. It was an old smell, the begetter of many a memory. And so on that day in August, in my 78th year, I sat down to begin the memoir which I swore I would never write. The two dreams could not be more contrasting. In one, I am walking up the avenue towards Drewsborough, the house I was born in, and it is a veritable temple. The gold light on the window panes rivering, the rooms flooded in a warm pink light as for a feasting within, and along the paling, torches of flame, furling and unfurling. And as I slid the hasp of the gate and walked towards the hall door, I see a line of men in livery, soldiers, the tips of their spears red hot through and through, as if they've been just pulled out of fire. These are hard men, and they bar the way. In the second dream, I am in the house, in the blue room where I was born, doors and windows all locked, and even the space under the door, where motes of dust used to sidle, is sealed with some kind of wadding. The furniture is, as it was, a double wardrobe of walnut with matching dressing table. There's a slop bucket in green with the plaited basket button. I am there alone and incarcerated. All the others have died, and I am there to answer for my crimes. It matters not that all my interrogators are dead. It seems to me that I saw things before I actually saw them. They were always there. The way I believe that the words are always there, whispering and coursing through us. I think, for instance, that I recognize the blue walls of the blue room, walls weeping quietly away with endless damp and no fire, even though there was a fire grate, in which a lid of a chocolate box had been laid as an ornament. And Our Lady, she was not the sallow creature in paintings that I would come to see on different walls, but a buxom woman, Our Lady of Limerick, with infants around her, as though she had just given birth to them. Her accouchement was far happier than that of my mother, who would talk of it down the years, her labor, her long labor, the night in December, and the black frost that was usual for that time of year. My father and his brother Jack were downstairs drinking, and on being told the good news, they staggered up, bringing strips of goose, which they had just cooked, it being close to Christmas. And in my mother's telling of it, the goose was half cooked, and Jack gave a rendering of Red River Valley. Come and sit by my side if you love me. Do not hasten to bid me adieu. Just remember the Red River Valley and the cowboy who loved you so true. Such is the ragbag of anecdote, hearsay, allegory, fable, and consternation that filled the canvas of my early life, at once beautiful and frightening and tender and, yes, savage. My father's family, where am I now? By the time I was born, we were no longer rich. We had a large house and 2 avenues, with 1,000 acres or more that my father had inherited, was sold off or given away in fits of generosity or bartered to pay debts. He had inherited a fortune from rich uncles who, when they were ordained as priests, emigrated to New England and served in the parish of Lowell outside Boston. There, they combined spiritual and secular powers by patenting a medicine called Father John's, which was reputed to be a cure for everything and sold by the gallon. My mother's family was different. They were poor people evicted from County Kildare who trudged across the bogs of Ireland, came to the mountains, and in a God-forsaken place built a cabin on a bit of stone land. And I sometimes attribute my two contrasting selves to my contrasting grandparents. The one, from my father's side, a lady, the other, a peasant. And quite recently, this was brought home to me because I was approached by an Irish newspaper to have my DNA tested, along with other people with so-called historic Irish family names. I balked at the procedure, but the journalist who rang me said that he would talk me through it. He would tell me what it entailed, so it came in the post. He told me what to do with the swab. I returned the swab, and in due course I was told that, according to their findings, I share a DNA with the last Tsarina of Russia, Marie Antoinette, and Susan Sarandon. So asked as I was what I felt about the royal lineage, I said that it was a bit unnerving and I would rather not go into it. Although I lived in the country and loved nature, the sleet, the rain that nourished the barley and the gold of a summer's day and all that, wildflowers, primroses, cow, everything, I loved the outdoors, I still do. At the same time, like every young person, I longed for the city. And my first night in Dublin, I found enthralling light, electric light, flooded the pavements and glinted off the steel of the defunct tram lines and sent a gold-threaded haze up into trees where birds, city birds, roosted. It was a Saturday night in the late 1940s, and my first walk into the city with my sister, Anna, the girl we shared digs with, and Maeve, all of us linked and in tweed coats. We passed a fairly shabby-looking hotel where they said hurlers and their followers drank after a match, and then a grocery shop, a select grocery shop, with cooked hams in the window, so tempting, so tempting. The breadcrumb crusting of mustard and brown sugar, studded with cloves. I was ravenous for food, for life, for the stories I would write, except that everything was effervescent and inchoate in my overexcitable brain. I had been made to work in a chemist's shop by my sensible family, who disapproved of the writing life. I often think my mother must have read Molly Bloom's soliloquy in another incarnation, because she felt that books reeked of sin, and she has a point, but we won't go to that this evening. Soft morning city lisp, I am leafy spiffing. So wrote James Joyce about Anna Livia. My mornings were not soft, nor were they that leafy, working in the chemist's shop for 12 hours a day. But funds permitting, twice monthly on my half day, I went to a stage show in the Capitol Theatre that was billed as Ireland's answer to Folie Bergère. It was a mecca. The stage with the gauze backdrop, peroxide blondes with flashy suspenders kicking their thighs and their legs to the heavens, their flesh so beautifully, so evenly bronzed, and their faces in contrast, a stark alabaster white. They were the backdrop to the main event when a crooner in a fawn suit with the come-hither smile strolled on. The goddesses already had formed a semicircle to be a balustrade for him to lean on. Then he came downstage to ravish rows of us besotted women and girls who had paid 1 shilling for this thrill. The collective swooning in that audience would be impossible to measure. When his first song was a signal to the yearning in each one of us. Brush those tears from your eyes and try and realize that from now on, I'll always be true. I went away, but I didn't mean to stay, and I will regret it till my dying day, and so on. By then, the handkerchiefs were out. And sometimes he would sing that verse again as a sop, while the chorus girls shrugged and pouted in a mimicry of a huff. At the stage door, we, the adorers, hovered, and he would emerge, smiling and whistling, and proud of his little audience. And 1 or 2 might be lucky enough to get a hurried autograph, and I was disappointed to see his handwriting was slovenly. But I watched him go down the lane, and it never occurred to me that he might single me out, except he did. It was brief. It was a beckon of the head to detach myself from the other yearners, and his asking me if he should call up the following Sunday around 2. And he made a note of my address in North Circular Road. Already I was negotiating the minefield of getting my sister and Anna out of the flat, and my hopes hinged on one thing, which is that they did corporal works of mercy on Sundays by visiting sick people in hospitals. Sunday, and the coast was clear. I made a sponge cake and laid a tea tray. Nice place, he said, as he climbed the 3 flights of stairs covered in dark linoleum and entered the kitchen, which doubled as sitting room. He was in a shabby suit, unshaven and without the pancake makeup, but still irresistible. He had never seen a tea cozy before. It was one of my mother's, made of mohair, with a mohair picture of a white cottage and a small red hall door. He thought it was nifty. As we sat on the sagging horsehair sofa exchanging sweet nothings, an unfortunate thing occurred. The door of a washstand, in which we also kept saucepans, colanders, frying pans, and a drum of vim, the door crept open of its own accord, revealing the ramshackle domestic life that was mine. He didn't seem to notice. He was already exploring the nape of my neck, my throat, saying ordinary things, but in that context, amazingly poetic. And I was thinking to myself, how lucky to have been singled out after my weeks of patient pursuit. The hooks of my brassiere yielded to his touch with a willingness, and when he removed my silk stockings and flung them into another corner, 2 unnerving thoughts arose. One, that my sister would return early, and the other, that the stockings, which had been twice to the invisible menders, would not survive this brawl and could not be repaired with nail varnish. Circuitousness could only go so far. He was now begging for the comforts of the bedroom, and as his entreaties intensified, so did my balk. I was skirting matters, jumping up to make tea. He had no interest in tea. He drew me back down roughly, and now I was on his lap, trembling, him telling me not to tremble because it wouldn't hurt. The dilemma, I tried to tell him, was my sister or Anna, both highly religious, would be returning at any moment. Why hadn't I mentioned that earlier? We could have met somewhere else. There was quiet dells in Phoenix Park where we could lie. It was getting testy. In a moment of sheer madness, I suggested that he might sing "Brush Those Tears From Your Eyes." There was nothing for it but candor. I spoke my fears, and sensing them, he cradled me in the crook of his arm and called me baby, baby, and said there was nothing to be afraid of, as he could go through me like butter. It was too shocking altogether. Pointing to the wall clock, I said they were due back by 3, which allowed for a mere 11 minutes of canoodling. Holding me fiercely now, he said he was game ball, and it could all be done and over in less than 11 minutes. Love's dream, that mystic linking which binds souls as well as bodies, had snapped, and I hauled myself out of his embrace. What did I want? What do you want? He asked. The spell was broken. He said, well, what a waste of time. He moved to the kitchen chair, took out his bicycle clips, and snapped them around the ankles of his navy gabardine trousers. Then, standing before the mirror that was next to the holy water font, he took out a broken white comb and ran it through the spill of his beautiful, soft brown hair. "Tolol," he said, and he got his smile back and hurried down that stairs. Tolol. The phrase was new to me, and I reckon it was Dublin slang. I would come across it again before long when I began to read James Joyce and found a Mr. McCoy saying "Tolol" to Leopold Bloom. Dublin in the 1950s at that time was a more trusting city, and second-hand books would be left on trestle tables outside the shop with awning above to keep off the downpour. And anyone might want to appropriate a book and walk off with it could. It was at a stall in Bachelor's Walk by the Liffey, and I found a slim volume called Introducing James Joyce by T.S. Eliot. I opened it at random. The paper was a pale lemony color. The print was small, the letters in a deep indented black. A sentence shot up at me. All blessed themselves, and Mr. Dedalus, with a sigh of pleasure, lifted from the dish the heavy cover pearled around the edges with glistening drops. The scene was the Christmas dinner in the Dedalus house, seen through the child's eyes of Stephen Dedalus. There was the great fire banked high, heartiness, witticisms, plum pudding studded with peeled almonds, sprigs of holly, merriment, glasses replenished, when a sudden dispute arose about priests meddling in politics and the church's hounding of Charles Stuart Parnell, who became called an adulterer. Reading it, I realized it could have been a Christmas dinner in our house, or in many a house in Ireland, maybe not with the same erudition, but with the same bitterness that split people and made them perpetually spiteful and unforgiving. I bought it for 4p and carried it with me everywhere, including to pharmacy lectures, so that I could read it at will and copy out those sentences, luminous and labyrinthine as they were. It was only when I copied them out that I began to realize how great they were. How great they were. The short, flawless snatches of dialogue, lush descriptions of corpses and pigs and kine, sea stones, and then these extraordinary ascensions in which worlds within worlds were made known to me. As is not surprising from what I have already given you samplings of, before long, I was 4 years in the pharmacy, I eloped in Gothic fashion. I eloped with a man who had already been married and a self-claimed communist, and was followed by a posse of intemperate men, especially my own father. So things there got rough, and I went with my husband, burned my boats with the previous incarnation of my life. I married in time and had 2 sons, Carlo and Sasha. And in a school essay, Sasha wrote what I think might probably be the best resume of my married life, far better than I could have written it. He wrote, "I live in a large cave with my mother and father. Each morning, my father goes out hunting, and if he is lucky, he catches a deer. While he is out, my mother dusts the cave." So I was dusting the cave. I was learning, or trying to learn, to write. Irish poets, learn your trade, Yeats said. And at that time, I came upon great American fiction. Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, and to my utter surprise, Emily Dickinson, whose weapon was subterfuge. I loved them all. I wanted to write, and I actually did not believe that I could do it. But perseverance, as I'm often asked by young writers, what's the most essential quality? And it's not ambition. Ambition is there, but it's secondary. Perseverance and faith in the thing one wants to do, regardless of anyone. So I published a book or two, as Carl mentioned. They were called A Smear on Irish Womanhood, and to the man I was married, they became a great threat. He was also a writer. So rather like Nora in The Doll's House, I made an exit from there and had a little money, but not much. And with my newfound freedom, aged 28, I began to sow my wild oats, as you will perceive, 12 years too late. And that was done by giving parties. My parties were legendary because they were very lavish. I'd read too many Irish mythological stories about parties. They were very lavish. They were also like a football fixture every Saturday evening, so everyone knew how to come. And many came, the famous and the infamous, or as one reviewer of my memoir put it, the beautiful and the damned. But the thing about writing is that no matter what parties, what fame, or what interruptions, cooking the goose, opening the door, 2 fires lit, and so on, the imperative was to somehow write, to keep writing, not to lose it, not to spend myself on too much of the outside world. And due to, I suppose, there's a lovely little verse of Ogden Nash's which says, she would have lived her life in nonchalance and insouciance, but for earning her living, which was rather insouciance. So I continued to write, and my themes have been, I would think, love, sacred and secular, God, or more precisely, Jesus Christ, the parents who both, I believed, who both fed and famished me, the ancestors that I did not, of course, know, but were for me the transmitters of old stories, and everywhere ghosts, in every hill and hollow from where I came from, I felt and still recall something ghostly that was both frightening and creative. And then after that, as life got harder, madness and the staving off of madness, and ultimately, of course, exile. And I'll read you a very short moment that's probably a kind of little window into exile, whether it's voluntary or imposed. Mine was voluntary. I went to see my first 3D film of Werner Herzog's Caves of Forgotten Dreams. I'd never seen a 3D film, so I found it unnerving. Everything, the beast, the rhinoceros, everything seemed to come inside. It was like a trip. It was like a LSD trip. And I tried to leave, but unfortunately, I felt that I couldn't get out because these images were following me. So I stayed back and became totally engrossed and admiring of this quest Werner Herzog made through these cave paintings into our pre-origin. So I came out of there very happy and feeling I had gone into another place. And it was what T.S. Eliot called the violet hour, people going home from work, going into supermarkets on foot, on bicycles. But it wasn't violet. It was a pewter sky. And I took the back streets in London that I knew now for a long time, and I preferred the back streets. And along the way, a woman stopped me and said she hoped I wouldn't mind. But as we were fellow country women, she would like to shake my hand. And then, for no particular reason, she began to tell me of a rich aunt she had in Dublin, Aunt Geraldine, who lived in Foxrock. And every spring, faithfully, Aunt Geraldine invited her on a journey to the burn to see the wild flowers that sprang up between flags of limestone. The whole place pickled, yes, pickled, with flowers on thin stalks, white, speckled, and blue. The blue of the gentian, the most fetching of all. She said what a marvel it was to set out on a morning in a pony and trap from a hotel, to be driven around and then at intervals to get out and just look at this feast of color. That blue, she said, that blue, as if it had melted into her. It was also the blue that I would one day had seen in a mosque in Istanbul, and it was the blue for the records dye that our mothers and our grandmothers put in the tub of rinsing water to freshen the linen and the blouses and give it a little tint. She said that the thing about these journeys in the pony and trap with her aunt was that they stayed with her forever. The blue flowers, the seats cut into the rocks from the wild Atlantic waves, and always, always along the shore, a dog chasing a ball. She remarked then on how often in the 60s she had seen me on those London streets, glamorous, long earrings, a patchwork suede coat. And what a life I must have lived. There were so many me's, the me she had seen, the me that sat weeping on a cushion in Antiquarius Market with Isabella, the Highland seer, her crystal ball wrapped in layer upon layer of cloth, like a mummy, waiting there as I might, with news from the Delphic oracle. The me that never ever conquered the fear of swimming, though I had taken lessons in the public baths. And a man stood on the ledge holding a piece of rope to which I clung, believing that we were winning, even when we were not. Before taking my leave of her, I mentioned that I had just seen Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Aren't they fabulous, she said. She had seen the film only yesterday. And I said, I felt sorry at hearing of footsteps, two humans, perhaps 1,000 years apart from one another, but never to meet. It was not two humans. It was not a man and a woman. It was a wolf and a child, she said, quietly, as if she did not want to offend me. Her words hit like an arrow, and I realized that in that dark chamber of a cinema, the separate footprints of man and woman had revived in me a love so strong that though it had not flourished, it had not died either. And so it lived on and on in that dark sock of secrecy. We were about to part, she saying that no doubt our paths would cross again, and I saying, I hope so. But we live here now, she said. We live here in England now. We do, I said. And it was as if the two countries warred and jostled and made friends inside me, like the two halves of my ever-warring self. At home, I turned on all the lights, including the red lamp in the upstairs room, and it did not seem empty at all. It was full of light, like a room readying itself for a last banquet. Thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you very much. allowed to stay. Hello, Teddy. It's over. Almost.
Almost.
That was great.
Did I go over the time?
No, not at all.
Edna,
Yes.
a few audience questions.
I asked Teddy if I went over the time. Oh, no, this is my question.
I don't think you went over. It was just right.
I can't hear.
You can't hear me?
Well, now I can.
Okay. The first question is for you. It says, have you ever felt that your writing is becoming too personal? And is there such a thing as too personal for a writer?
In writing, you become what? Too personal?
Have you ever felt that your writing had become too personal?
Personal.
Yeah, and is there such a thing as too personal for a writer?
Well, I wouldn't know how to make it impersonal, would you? I think I'd like to actually answer it a little more seriously. What may seem personal has in it, by necessity, if it's going to be any good on the page, a quality of the impersonal. Writing is not a diary, and it's not a letter home. The writers I revere, I've mentioned many I revered, but Marcel Proust, I'm just mentioning it about being personal, would seem to be a very personal writer, and yet his story is true for others as well, and likewise Tolstoy. I think that it is very important that the writer, and in this case me, while being personal, is also at hand with the shears. And that is what, but of course I could be wrong, but that is what I'm trying or have been trying to do.
Teddy, do you want to answer it as well?
Oh, not for Edna, but who's answered it very well. I agree. I feel that the universal comes through the most penetrating attempt to be intimate and personal and revealing, and that starting out with generalization is a way to be meaningless and neither personal nor impersonal.
Teddy, this one is for you. It asks, do you think you worried more over the reception of your first novel than all the rest?
No, I'm very democratic with my anxiety. Each novel makes me worry hugely. Having said that, Nevermind was particularly grueling, and I did almost withdraw it from publication every day after it had been accepted by Heinemann, and I would ring up the publisher's number, and when someone picked up the telephone the other end, I'd hang up. But I mean, it was such a close split, you know, for 49.9% of me wanted to withdraw it. And I twice fainted I wasn't taking any drugs in those days. I just fainted from a sense of intolerable conflict between my desire to tell the story and to suppress it. And I projected my sense of shame onto other people and thought that they would be disgusted by the story I was telling. So I think probably that one does pip the others at the post, yeah.
Edna, did you have similar thoughts?
I think actually the 21st novel is harder than the first. Because when you write the first book, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know that you might be going to be savaged and many things said. You get a little both wiser and woundeder, if there's such a thing, as the novels go on. It's thought one gets hardened, but I don't think that's true. So when my first novel came out, I had a letter from the convent of a nun in the convent. I recognized her handwriting, and I could even see the little cyst in her eye. I opened the letter, and she said, "We hear you have written a book. We give credence an open mind." Well, I knew that was not going to be. And then there was lots of brouhaha, and the book was burnt in my native village. And my mother said women fainted, and I said they might have fainted from turf smoke, and so on. So I had much to do to defend myself, but I wasn't expecting it. So why I say the 21st or the 5th or the 8th novel makes one even more sleepless nights is that you kind of already have had a little taste of what can happen. And it isn't all a glamorous publisher's party. In fact, they don't give parties much anymore, do they? Tonight is the party.
Edna, did the nuns ever come around?
Sorry?
The nuns, did they ever come around to you?
No, they didn't. And to make revenge, I suppose, sweeter, although they weren't they were bad, why should I say? They folded up. There weren't enough people with vocations. So convents are now hotels or gymnasiums or spas or something. There's not enough nuns. No, they didn't come around. Others did, though. Others did.
Here's another one. And Edna, it's addressed to you, but you both can answer it. It says, Miss O'Brien, there's a scene in your memoir where you are sitting with Samuel Beckett and you quote a line that he had written himself about the painter Jack Yates, which is that the artist who stakes his being is from nowhere and has no kin. Are you sympathetic to that view?
I think it's a fantastic thing within Samuel Beckett, whom I know Teddy also loves, was such a sensible man as well as being a great genius. And he did write that. The artist who stakes his life has no brother and comes from nowhere. It's a little ironic because Jack Yates had a brother called William Butler Yeats, but I don't think they were that close. And where I first read it, and I almost stole the book, and I'm not a born kleptomaniac, but I read it in the London Library, and they had this beautiful edition of Jack Yeats's drawings and paintings with Samuel Beckett's preface. And I thought, any writer should be given this as a little mantra, because you can't write thinking what your mother, your grandmother, your best friend, your wife, you can't be. It's hard enough to write without being throttled. But it also is a manifesto. There's freedom in it and there's power in it. But to just tell you 1 second more about Samuel Beckett, he claimed never to remember anything he had written. And actors, Jackie McGowan and Pat McGee, and lots of great actors whom he wrote these plays for, in drink, and they were all drinkers, why not, would quote lines of his to himself in the... And he'd say, who wrote that? I think he knew who wrote it, but he maintained an aloofness and a modesty, and yet, talking of personal in the first question, his fiction, Malone Dies and Malloy, and a genius short story called First Love, are among the most personal I've ever read. Savage, but personal.
Yes, I don't have anything to add. I agree. I agree. I mean, it's yet more proof that Beckett loved the word no. No brother, nowhere, the sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing new. I love that negation in Beckett. All his effects are achieved by subtraction, and it's a very powerful way to write.
Teddy, this next one is for you. It says, how did becoming a parent affect your writing? And how did the deaths of your parents affect your writing?
I think Mother's Milk is a testament to how having children affected my writing. I think the two last books are more empathic and tender, as a result of having children. My parents' death had a very literal effect on my writing. They produced bad news on the one hand and at last on the other. So, and now I've got no parents left. It's hard to think what to write about next.
Edna, do you want to answer that one as well?
Do I what?
The question about, it was for Teddy, but it says, how did becoming a parent affect your writing, but also how did losing your parents affect your writing?
I think we'd need another evening for that.
All right. All right, one more, and half of it is for Teddy and half for Edna. The first for Teddy is, will there be a Patrick Melrose movie after all?
I very much hope so. The producers of a television series which is being formed at the moment live in New York, and I can't see the audience, but maybe here. And we're at an exciting phase where it looks as if that will finally happen, and there will be a television series of all 5 Melrose novels. And yeah.
And the related question for Edna is, who plays Edna O'Brien in a film adaptation of your life?
Oh, this is nice. Is there a producer in the audience? Well, you know, it's a hard one, but I do think there are so many. But I do think, I was talking to someone today, my friend and hairdresser, and he mentioned Mrs. Thatcher, to whom he was not espoused, or whatever the word is, wasn't fond of. I said, but Meryl Streep made a great job of Mrs. Thatcher. And then I heard myself saying, Meryl Streep makes a great job of doing everything. It's an ideal question and an impossible one. The actress in the world that enchants me or haunts me most of all, and always will, is Greta Garbo. Not that she'd be playing me, but I would like to say up there in the heavens, hello to Greta Garbo.
Another one of those ghosts. Thank you. Thank you both, and thank you all for coming.